This video is going to look at the second part of chapter 12 on aggregate expenditures, focusing on investment, government spending, net exports, and then putting it all together. And then I'm also going to do a few practice problems so you can see how to work out some similar questions on your exam or on the homework. Now, chapter 12, part 2 starts off with looking at investment. Now, investment is such an important part of the economy because it affects both short-run aggregate demand and also long-run economic growth. And the dollars that's spent on investment have this immediate impact of increasing spending in the current time period. But because of the nature of investment, it also has a long-term impact on the economy as well. In the sense that if a company buys a new machine, that machine is going to operate, continue to produce, and will have an impact on the productive capacity of the economy for years to come. Now, looking at some of the factors that determines the level of investment spending, we're going to see that investment is going to be guided by the profit motive. Firms invest expecting a return on their investment. Now, before the investment takes place, firms only know their expected rate of return. Therefore, investment is always going to involve some risk on the firm's part. So the key variable that we're going to use to decide whether investment makes sense is to look at the real interest rate. So that's where this investment demand curve comes into play. So our investment demand curve is going to look at the relationship between our interest rates and also investment. So we can say real investment down here. Now we're going to see that our investment demand curve is going to be downward sloping because we see that at higher rates of interest, so maybe like 12%, firms don't want to invest as much. But as the interest rate becomes lower, we see that that leads to an increase in the amount that firms want to invest. And so forth. So the general investment rule is that businesses will undertake all planned investment projects for which the expected rate of profit equals or exceeds the interest rate. So the higher the real rate of interest, as we have like up here, we see the fewer investment opportunities that are going to be profitable. But as you get to lower interest rates, like point B here, we see that that gives you more investment opportunities that will hopefully be profitable. Now, we talked about some of the things that affects the level of investment. So as I've just highlighted, the interest rate. Now, the interest rate is going to cause movements along the investment demand curve. So a movement would be, once again, going from point A to point B. So that will lead to an increase in the amount that firms want to invest because we see that the interest rate is getting lower. Now, all of these other things, the expectations about future profitability, that will cause a shift of our investment demand curve. So we can go from D1 to D2. So our investment demand curve, or I guess I should put this as I2. All right, so from I1 to I2 will be considered an increase in investment. So I1 to I2 will be considered an increase in investment. And then if you were going from I2 to I1, that will be considered a decrease in investment. So let's very briefly look at some of these factors that cause the investment demand curve to shift. And these are highlighted in the notes. But first is going to be this expectation for profitability. Expectations for profitability. So we know that a change in the capital stock, so the machines, equipments, building, etc., changes future production capacity or the amount that firms are able to produce. So therefore, plans to change that capital stock depends crucially on expectations. So a firm is going to consider likely future sales. Now, if firms are pessimistic that maybe there's not going to be that many good opportunities for profitability in the future, at every rate of interest, we're going to see that that's going to lead to a leftward shift of our demand curve or our investment demand curve. Now, if we see that firms are very confident, so if they're very optimistic, that's going to lead to an increase in our investment demand curve. So from I1 to I2. And then we also have taxes, as we have here. Now our taxes play a part based off of like our public policy. So public policy can have significant effects on the demand for capital. So this could be a strategy for stimulating investment by the government. It could be a reduction or increase in taxes on corporate profits. So greater after-tax profits means that firms can retain a greater portion of any return on an investment. So an increase in business taxes will likely reduce the after-tax profit, once again causing our investment demand curve to shift to the left. So that would be from I2 to I1. However, a decrease in business taxes, or in some instances like a tax credit, that will increase the after-tax profit, once again making it more profitable for firms to continue to produce or invest more. So that will shift the investment demand curve to the right. Now we also talked about cash flow. So once again, firms like to reinvest some of their money into the company. If they don't have a lot of money to reinvest, that's going to lead to a decrease in investment. And if they have a lot more after-tax profit, then that can lead to an increase in investment. And then I also talked about capacity utilization. So capacity is going to be the maximum possible output of a firm or industry. So if a large percentage of their current capital stock is being utilized, firms are more likely to increase investment than they would if a large percentage of the capital stock were sitting idly. So if your machinery and your equipment is already operating at full capacity, that's a huge indicator to firms that they might want to increase the investment. However, if you have a lot of machines just sitting idle or you're not utilizing them, then it really doesn't make sense to invest in more machine if you can't, or equipment, if you can't get rid of the production that you're already making. So when we look at investment spending, we see that investment spending is what we call an autonomous expenditure. Investment is going to be considered an autonomous expenditure. Now, what it means for it to be an autonomous expenditure is that, assuming that no other factors change in the short run, investment spending is not going to be hinged on people's current income and spending. Instead, investment is primarily a function of current sales relative to a company's capacity, their expected future sales, and also the interest rate. Now, we're also going to see that government spending and your net exports are also autonomous expenditures. So once again, meaning that they don't vary based on people's current income and spending. Now we're going to see what that looks like in just a second as we put our aggregate expenditures model together. Now with our aggregate expenditures model, I like this example that I included here, looking at finding our equilibrium. So we have this 45-degree line here. Whenever you have a 45-degree line on a graph, that just means that whatever is on your x-axis and whatever is on your y-axis are both the same. Now we're going to be making a model of the entire national economy, or our macro economy. Now we're going to base it on the following idea: that if total output exceeds what people want to buy, there's going to be stuff left over, which means that inventories of unsold goods will rise. Now, on the other hand, if people want to buy more than is produced during some period of time, we're going to see that that's going to cause inventories to accumulate. On the other hand, if people want to buy more than what is produced during some period of time, we'll see. On the other hand, if people want to buy more than is produced during some period of time, we're going to see that that's going to cause our inventories to fall. So the analogy that I like to use is one about a shoe store. So if you think about any shoe store in your city or wherever, it has a certain amount of inventory that it wants to keep on hand at all times to be able to satisfy normal customer demand. Now, if customers buy shoes at a slower rate than it gets new shipments from the manufacturers, we're going to see that their inventory is going to start piling up. Now, if on the other hand, customers buy shoes at a more rapid pace than they're getting shipments from the factory, inventories are going to fall. So we think about the entire economy this way, and you'll understand how we think about output and how it adjusts to demand. Now, whenever we talk about equilibrium, equilibrium just means a position of stability. Now, if inventories are rising, we're not in equilibrium because too many goods are being made, and sooner or later, factories are going to have to cut production because the current level of output is not sustainable. Now, if inventories are falling, on the other hand, we're not in equilibrium because too few goods are being made, and sooner or later, factories are going to have to increase production. So in other words, our macro equilibrium is just when our total output is equal to the total desired expenditures. Now, we believe that we have the national economy will move towards that macro equilibrium on its own. So as we look at our graph here, we have this 45-degree line, which once again just means that everything that's on our y-axis, so in this case, the amount of Pepsi sold, which would be our aggregate expenditures, is equal to the quantity of Pepsi produced, which would be our GDP. Now, looking at our macro equilibrium can occur any point along this 45-degree line. So at point A and point B, macro equilibrium can occur because we see that that's where our aggregate expenditures and our output are going to be equal. But if we look at point C here, point C, we'll see that inventories are going to be depleted, and the reason why is because consumers are buying 10 trillion bottles of Pepsi, whereas only 6 trillion are being produced. So as we talked about, anytime that's the amount that's sold or consumer spending is greater than the production, we're going to have our inventories being depleted. On the other hand, if we look at point D here, at point D, we see that inventories are growing because we see that consumers are only buying 4 trillion, whereas they're producing 8 trillion. So once again, there's going to be a lot of bottles of Pepsi that's just going to be left over. And we'll see that inventories are going to start piling up, which is going to be a sign to firms that production must fall. So as we get ready to find our macro equilibrium, as we've been talking about, all that means is that macro equilibrium simply means that the left side, which is indicated by this Y, must equal the right side, which is going to be our aggregate expenditures. All right, so equilibrium once again is just this position of stability. So let's build our aggregate expenditures model, and then we'll see how we can find our macro equilibrium. Now, we always start by placing consumption on the diagram. So last week we looked at our consumption function, showing us the relationship between our disposable income and our consumption. So you start with consumption, and then we said that investment spending, government spending, and net exports are autonomous expenditures. What that means is that as we add in investment, it's just going to shift our curve up. So C plus I. Next, we'll add in our government spending. Once again, since it's autonomous, it's just going to be a parallel shift upward. So we have C plus I plus G. And then our last component is going to be our net exports. Once again, another autonomous expenditure. So we'll have another parallel shift upward. So now we have C plus I plus G plus our net exports, which is equal to our aggregate expenditures. So we looked at a lot of the things that can shift our consumption function upward, whether it's the price level or expectations about wealth or expectations about future income or our wealth. And we looked at some of the things that shift our investment demand curve up or down, whether that's going to be things like the capacity utilization, business taxes, or your expectations for profitability. So if we have things shifting our consumption function up, that will cause an upward shift, and I'll get to that in just a second. Now, in this economy, on the example that we have here, we're going to see that our equilibrium occurs right here. So once again, equilibrium is always going to occur where our aggregate expenditures model crosses this 45-degree line. So we see that equilibrium will occur right here at 10 trillion. Now, the question is posed, what will happen if real GDP were at 8 trillion? Now, if real GDP is at 8 trillion, we see, if we look at our real aggregate expenditures, that it's maybe like 8.5 here. Now, anytime we see that we have spending of 8.5, which means that there's 8.5 trillion units being, or $1 trillion worth of goods being sold, but only 8 trillion being produced, that's going to cause this unplanned decrease in our inventories. Once again, we said that anytime that spending is greater than production, it's going to cause our inventories to be depleted. So what typically happens is we'll say that this 10 trillion is our potential. But in this case, we're actually producing right here at 8 trillion. So we have what we call a recessionary gap. This is a recessionary gap which occurs whenever our potential is greater than where we're actually at. So once again, this unplanned decrease in our inventories will lead to an increase in production, so that we can eventually get back up to this 10 trillion or equilibrium. So let's look at what would happen if real GDP was actually at 12 trillion. So this is where we're producing at. Now, if real GDP is at 12 trillion, we see that spending would be maybe around 11 trillion here. Now, anytime we see that production is greater than our potential, we have what's called an inflationary gap. So what this means is that we're going to have an unplanned increase in our inventories. We have an unplanned increase in our inventories because we have these units that's left over that we're not able to sell since spending is not keeping up with production. So that's going to result in a decrease in production. Now on this slide, we have our table showing all of the information. So remember that investment spending, government spending, and net exports are all autonomous expenditures. So as you see, they're constant all the way down. So they don't change. Whereas we do see that our consumption is increasing. Now, in order to find your aggregate expenditures, all you do is add up your C plus your I plus your G plus your net exports. So 6,200 plus 1,500 plus 1,500 minus 500 is going to give us 8,700. So that's how we find our aggregate expenditures. So we have our column showing real GDP, which is our production, and we have our column showing our aggregate expenditures, which is our spending. Now remember, we said that anytime that spending is greater than our production, as we have right here, that's going to lead to our inventories being depleted because we're not able to keep up with consumer spending. So anytime our inventories are being depleted, what's going to happen is real GDP is going to increase. So that signals firms to increase their production. As they increase their production, they hire more workers, as we talked about in our chapter on business cycles. Now, conversely, we see that whenever production is greater than spending, it's going to cause an accumulation of our inventory. So inventories start piling up because you're unable to get rid of the goods that you're producing. So what that does is it signals to firms to decrease production. So real GDP is going to go down. As real GDP goes down, we see unemployment goes up. So let's look at some practice problems. Now I'll complete this in its entirety and post it in Western Online so you guys can use it to practice. But let's look at finding our macro equilibrium given the information that we have. So remember we said that investment spending, government spending, and our net exports are all going to be autonomous expenditures, which means that they don't change. So they're going to be constant all the way down. So as we add up our aggregate expenditures, this one is going to be 1.8. We'll have, well, let me just make this so that my lines stay together. Not the best table. So we have 1.8. This is going to be 2.5. This will be 3.2. This is going to be 3.9. This is going to be 4.6. 5.3. 6. 6.7. And then 7.4. So now what we'll do is we'll compare our production to our spending. So right here we see with production 0, spending's 1.8, so we're going to have inventories being depleted. So this is going to be a negative 1.8. This will be a negative 1.5. Production's at 1 trillion, spending's at 2.5, so all you're doing is just taking y minus your AE. So next we have negative 1.2, negative 0.9, negative 0.6, negative 0.3, 0, 0.3, and 0.6. So once again, we see that anytime our aggregate expenditures is greater than our production, our inventories are going to be depleted. We said that anytime that inventories are being depleted, this is a signal for firms to increase production. And then we see that employment goes in the same direction as GDP. So as you produce more, you need more workers. So this happens all these scenarios where our aggregate expenditures is greater than our production. Now we see that whenever our production is greater than our spending, that's going to cause the accumulation of our inventories. Now whenever inventories are accumulating, that's a signal to firms to decrease production, so to cut back. So real GDP is going to go down. And as real GDP goes down, we see that employment goes down as well. Now your MPC from this table, we're going to focus on consumption here. So our MPC is going to be our change in consumption divided by our change in disposable income, which is going to be identified by Y here. So as we go from 0.4 to 1.1, that's going to be 0.7. As we go from 0 to 1, 1. So our MPC is going to be 0.7. Now, when it says what does it mean for inventories to be depleting or accumulated, when inventories are depleted, that's when a company does not have enough on hand to satisfy their current demand, as we talked about with the shoe example. Now, that's going to be bad because it can lead to higher average prices, aka inflation. Now, inventories accumulate when firms can't sell all of their current goods. So this tends to lead to unemployment as firms reduce their output. So even though we can have macro equilibrium, that doesn't mean that we're at full employment. Identify on the graph below the two scenarios when our actual output isn't equal to our potential, and briefly explain each. So we would see that our macro equilibrium would occur right here. So if this was our aggregate expenditures model. Now there's two scenarios that can occur. Let's say that this is our actual. So we can have when we're producing more than what our potential is. So let's say that this was our potential. So whenever our potential is less than our actual, what that means is that we're producing more than we should be. Whenever we're producing more than what our potential is, what we'll see is that we're producing more than we should because people are spending a lot. Now, that's not going to be sustainable because that can drive prices up across the economy, as we looked at in our chapter on inflation. Now, we also have the scenario where we're producing less than what our potential is. Anytime we're producing less than what our potential is, what we're seeing is that we're just not producing enough. So we're not at our full potential. So that's when you have high unemployment. And as I mentioned with our other scenario, if you're producing more than our potential, that's going to lead to inflation. So once again, both of these scenarios, it's going to be a balancing act because we don't want high unemployment and we also don't want high inflation because we want to have stable prices. So how do we close the recessionary gap, and then how do we close the inflationary gap? Now this one would be considered our inflationary gap. Because once again, we're producing a lot more than what we should be. Now, in order to close an inflationary gap, we'll see that our aggregate expenditures will need to shift downward. So we would need our aggregate expenditures to shift down to close this inflationary gap. So it can shift downward by causing any of the components of aggregate expenditures to shift down. So that could be a decrease in consumption, that could be a decrease in investment spending, a decrease in government spending, or a decrease in our net exports. Now, to close a recessionary gap, our recessionary gap would be right here. Now, to close a recessionary gap, we will see that our aggregate expenditures would need to shift upward. So we need to shift upward in order for us to close that. So that could be an increase in any of the components of aggregate expenditures, whether that's consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports. Let's look at question number 11 here. So assume that the economy is in a recession, the MPC is 0.8, and an increase of $200 billion in spending is needed to reach full employment. The target can be reached if government spending is increased by how much? Now, this one ties right into our multiplier example. Now in the notes, we saw that the formula for the multiplier is going to be equal to 1 over 1 minus our MPC, which in this case is going to be equal to 1 over 1 minus 0.8, so 1 over 0.2, so our multiplier is going to be 5. Now the other formula that we have for our multiplier is that it's going to be equal to our change in real GDP divided by that initial change, because we know that initial change is going to go through multiple rounds of spending as the notes talked about. So our initial change in any of the components of aggregate expenditures, in this case, is going to be government. So we know that our multiplier is 5. We see that we need an increase of 200 billion. So we need to know what's that initial change in government spending in order for us to get to that 200 billion. So solving for that, we have 5x is equal to 200. So x is going to be equal to 40. So we will see that government spending needs to increase by 40 billion in this case. Let's look at some of the some of the questions from your homework. So we'll go through those very quickly. So if y is equal to 500 billion, autonomous consumption is equal to 400 billion, and the MPS is 0.2, then savings will equal what? All right. So we know that y is equal to c plus s. This is what we're going to come back to. Y is equal to c plus s. Now our formula for consumption is equal to, we said a plus b y sub d, where a represents our autonomous consumption. So we know c is equal to, our autonomous is 400 here, plus b represents our MPC, and we're given our MPS, but we know that the MPC plus MPS is equal to 1. So if our MPS is 0.2, then our MPC must be 0.8. So we can just plug that in, 0.8. And then we have y, which is the 500. So let's solve for consumption. So c is equal to 400 plus 0.8 times 500 is going to be, get my calculator, 400. So we see that consumption is going to be 800. All right, so now that we know what consumption is, which is right here, let's go in and find our savings, because y is once again going to be 500. We know that consumption is 800, so plus savings. Subtract the 800 from both sides, so negative 300 is equal to our savings. And so it's right here. In the aggregate expenditures model, if aggregate expenditures equals 6 trillion and GDP equals 7 trillion, then what happens? Now we said that anytime that spending is less, so in this case spending is less than production, that means that we're going to have an accumulation of our inventory, because we see that you're not able to, or consumers aren't keeping up with the level of production in terms of spending. So inventories are going to accumulate by 1 trillion. A $500 increase in investment will shift the aggregate expenditures curve up by. Now, with this one, we said that investment is an autonomous consumption. So if we started with C, investment is always going to be a parallel shift. So we know that it's going to shift it up by exactly 500. Let's cross these out. But then what's going to happen? So exactly 500, and now we know that it's not going to increase our equilibrium level of real GDP by exactly 500, because we know that that 500 investment is going to go through multiple rounds of spending and respending throughout the economy based on our multiplier. So we know that it's going to be more than 500, because once again it's going to go through multiple rounds of spending and respending. Now, which of the following options could be used to eliminate a recessionary gap? So a recessionary gap, I guess if we just go back to up here. So our recessionary gap occurs whenever our potential is greater than our actual output. So we said that in order to fix a recessionary gap, that we would need our aggregate expenditures function to shift upward. So if we need our aggregate expenditures function to shift upward, which one of the components of aggregate expenditures, consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports, will cause an increase in that variable? So we know that we don't want a decrease in consumption because that will shift it downward. We don't want a decrease in investment because once again that will shift it downward. We know an increase in taxes causes a decrease in investment. So we know that that's not it, and I don't know why the zero is here. So our answer is going to be the second option, increase in investment. So that's how we would eliminate this recessionary gap. So by having that upward shift of our aggregate expenditures curve or model. So I hope this helps. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. If you watch this video in its entirety, shoot me an email and let me know, because you will receive some extra credit going on to exam 3. So just shoot me an email and say I watched the whole video and I want my extra credit. So once again, let me know if you have any questions.